afternoon, everybody. Thank you for your patience, and welcome to the Johns Hopkins University Bloomberg Center, our home in the heart of the nation's capital. I'm Sibel Bjorklund. I'm the Executive Director of the Hopkins Bloomberg Center and the Vice President for Federal Strategy for Johns Hopkins University in Medicine. We are thrilled that all of you can join us today for this important conversation with Senator Sheldon Whitehouse of Rhode Island, and hopefully Senator Dan Sullivan of Alaska. They're coming here today to talk about their bipartisan legislation, Save Our Seas Act 2.0, and talk about what it takes to pass bipartisan environmental protection legislation in this day and age. I want to thank the senators for their leadership and for joining us today, and I want to thank Allison Chu of the Washington Post for moderating today's discussion. Today's event is part of a series anchored here at the Hopkins Bloomberg Center, which we call The Bridge, which is designed to highlight what's working in Washington. Right now, the Senate schedule is giving us fits. And so while we wanted to have both the senators up here together, we're going to get started with Senator Whitehouse and hope that Senator Sullivan can get here in time before they're both pulled back to the Senate floor for votes. We are so close, yet so far. So the Bridge provides a public forum for bipartisan dialogue between leaders who are tackling some of the most pressing policy challenges. This one is also an opportunity for us to hear from noted Johns Hopkins experts and faculty who are at the forefront of research on these same issues. For today, once the senators finish and head back for the vote, we will also hear in the second part of our conversation from two of our faculty experts. David Love, who's a research professor at the Bloomberg School of Public Health, is an expert in food systems and sustainability. And Vicki Nguyen, professor of mechanical engineering at Hopkins Whiting School of Engineering, is developing a process to create sustainable plastics. Our topic is as timely and as climate and the environment take center stage while world leaders gather at the UN General Assembly and Climate Week in New York to tackle a range of issues, including climate solutions. Before we start, as I mentioned, we'll have a little bit of coming and going, and we thank you for your flexibility. And we especially thank the senator who's here to talk about his bipartisan work without his bipartisan friend. So with that, if Allison and Senator Whitehouse can come to the stage, we'll get started with the program. Thank you.
Senator, thank you so much for...
Yeah. Does this mean I can get Dan in really big trouble by saying what he would have said?
I think you should absolutely role play as Senator Sullivan as well. We'll just have you shift seats and,
Exactly.
and change your voice a little bit.
Exactly.
It'll be great. Yeah, no one will find that confusing at all. So, you know, we're here to talk about the Save Our Seas Act, which was signed into law in 2020. And I think we would love to all hear, you know, what the process of getting that legislation passed was like, and even sort of an overview of what it's designed to do.
Yeah. Well, it began with a hearing in the Environment Public Works Committee about ocean plastic, during which Dan came up to me, typical Alaska to Rhode Island thing, and said, "You pick up your ocean plastic waste in trash bags. We have to pick ours up with front-end loaders and dumpsters and barges." So, you know, he was really interested in the topic, and that hearing and his interest led us to do the first Save Our Seas Act, which was a tiny little bill really designed to test the proposition whether the Senate could, you know, legislate in bipartisan fashion on a new issue, ocean plastic waste. And sure enough, we could. The bill passed by unanimous consent. So that gave us a lot more enthusiasm to press forward with SOS 2.0. Interestingly, this legislation, the original SOS bill, even though it did not accomplish a great deal legislatively, cast a signal out into the executive branch, so that Sibel is nodding, she remembers this kind of action, where those who wanted to work on ocean plastics in the executive branch, particularly at USAID, took this as a signal that they could lean in even further. So it had an effect beyond its actual legislative language. And then we went on to SOS 2.0, which again passed by unanimous consent. And we went to the House and rounded up co-sponsors there and said, "Hey, here's some legislation that passed in the Senate by unanimous consent. Let's get it done." And And it worked. So now we're working on 3.0, and we took a little recess to do a separate bill working together on fisheries. So it's been a very constant workload between the White House and Sullivan offices, and we both have very good staff that make that all work smoothly. And while it may look like there was a bit of an intermission, the intermission was actually filled with good work on international fisheries protection.
Absolutely. And as you mentioned, with the first iteration of Save Our Seas and what is in Save Our Seas 2.0, what have you seen as sort of the biggest impacts from the latest version of the law, over the past, I guess, roughly 4 years or so at this point?
Well, we've got the Ocean Plastics Foundation up and running. It's located in beautiful Juneau, Alaska. And we're, working through the first innovation prizes. And it has really helped inform and lift up the participation of the State Department and USAID in the International Plastics Treaty that's started in Nairobi and has been worked on fairly steadily since. So it's had a couple of pretty profound effects. It's also, I think, been helpful at encouraging the corporate community to do more. I'll give a big thumbs up to the mega corporation Unilever, which I think has set the corporate standard for taking care of its own plastics getting out into the world, including with the promise they made in Oslo at the Our Oceans conference that for every kilo they put out, they were going to find a kilo and bring it back and see that it's properly disposed of.
Yeah, I'm glad you bring up Unilever, because I remember when Save Our Seas 2.0 was signed into law, there were a number of environmental advocates, who did raise some concerns with the act itself, noting that, while many of the strategies laid out in it, aren't inherently bad, their focus was sort of largely on cleaning up marine debris, right, versus sort of looking at the source of all the plastic that was, flooding into our environment. And I'm curious, what role you see the law, the current 2.0 and what you're working on with 3.0 sort of playing in the broader effort to address the global plastic pollution crisis.
Well, we haven't settled on 3.0 yet, but I think it's fair to say that one of the key issues we're looking at is recycling, and the extent to which recycling is a bit of a sham, at least as to plastics, with maybe somewhere between 5 and 10% of what goes into your blue bin ever being recycled. It's a sham in which we are all asked to be participants, which makes it a particularly devilish sham. And then on the other side, if you look at single-use plastics, we've managed to achieve all of 1% recycled use for single-use plastics. So clearly, huge other failure there. So to what extent will reporting drive better behavior? To what extent do we need to change the market for recycled products? Those are all issues that I think we're going to have to deal with. The other would be to take a look at what I would call the Unilever model and ask big companies that put a lot of plastic out into the world to at least report on how much plastic they put out into the world in any given year and how much they brought back out of the world and responsibly disposed of, so that if it's 2%, they can start to be held accountable for it only being 2%.
I mean, what would you, in sort of an ideal world, like to see when it comes to policy in terms of being able to tackle both sort of the upstream issues that we're seeing and also dealing with the amount of plastic that already exists in the environment? Yeah,
to me, the key thing is the underlying price signal, whether you're dealing about climate change or whether you're dealing about plastic pollution. If there's a free-to-pollute business model, it's really hard to work your way upstream against that economic tide. So that has not been an area that has lent itself to bipartisanship, but I do have a virgin plastics fee of 20 cents per pound on nurdles, so that if it's headed for single-use plastic, you've got to pay the fee, and that should bring the recycles market more into balance with the new plastic market, so you're not putting every year, so many millions of tons of new plastic out into the world that we then don't bother to account for well. So to me, that's the big kind of missing link, is to make the economics of this work. And it's just as true for climate change as it is for plastic waste. In fact, I think at this point there are no safe pathways to climate safety that don't involve putting a price on carbon pollution. We've exhausted all of those by our delay.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, and you know that is such an important point when we're looking at sort of the broader issues around climate change, and you know, when we're looking at sort of the solutions that exist, you have technology, you know, individual action in some cases, and then there's policy, and you know, obviously you're intimately familiar with the impact that policy can have on life and society, and I would love to hear more about, you know, what you think the role of sort of well-designed, strong policy can play in combating climate change at large.
Yeah, I think it's to bring proper economic balance. Milton Friedman was the great, you know, right-wing conservative economist, and he'd be the first to admit that you don't have proper market economics if one participant in the market is able to avoid paying for the consequences of their harm, the negative externalities of selling their product. That was kind of Econ 101. But Politics 101 is to go up the road here and protect your free-to-pollute business model and violate that elementary economic market principle. And the plastics industry, the fossil fuel industry have been very, 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 very good at playing that game. But it's not correct economically, it's not correct morally, it's not correct in terms of efficacy. So there's a lot to deplore about the free-to-pollute business model.
Yeah, and with Save Our Seas 2.0, it seemed like there was a lot of support from the plastics industry on that. Like, how did that come to be, given, you know, what you just
well,
mentioned?
It wasn't, you know, SOS was a pretty small bill. SOS 2.0 was also a pretty small bill. So, you know, we're trying to kind of grow our way into it. Mm-hmm. As people experienced in the Senate will know, there are only three ways that you get a bill passed. One is by getting floor time for the bill, and given the demands on Senate floor time for a bill on ocean plastics, fat chance. So forget that. The next is to attach it to a bill that is going to pass, like the National Defense Authorization Bill or a big appropriations measure. That requires a lot of checking in with a great number of chairmen and ranking members. It's a very bipartisan process. So that can be very difficult to achieve. And then the third is unanimous consent. And where unanimous consent comes in really handy, I'll mention our Fisheries Act briefly. Our Fisheries Act touches 7 different Senate committees. So if we want to move that bill by getting it onto a vehicle like the NDAA, we have 7 chairmen, 7 ranking members, and their reciprocals in the House who need to all sign off on it. So that's such a torture process, it's often worth it just to go straight to the floor and start banging away at unanimous consent until your adversaries come out of the woodwork and you can deal with whatever their problem is or get them to, you know, back off. Mm-hmm. So, but once unanimous consent is your pathway, you're not going to be doing the most bold and abrupt things.
Absolutely.
And here's Dan Sullivan. Look at that.
Senator Sullivan is here, so we can give him a couple minutes while he's getting mic'd up. But before he jumps on, oh, well, here he is now.
We've just been talking about how size doesn't matter, that the fact that Alaska is enormous really is no big deal, and that Rhode Island's a much cooler place. But other than that, that's all we've been talking about.
Certainly more punctual.
Good seeing you.
All right.
Yeah, well.
Senator, thank you for your time.
Okay, great. Sorry, guys.
No problem. We're really excited to have you both now.
Yeah, it's great.
Yeah.
We did a quick overview of the history of SOS 2.0.
Good.
SOS 3.0 being kind of looking at recycling and a little bit more reporting on plastics return, the Unilever model, and then just briefly touching on the Fish Act as a
Good.
example of how unanimous consent can be better than trying to line up so many damned chairman and ranking member.
Yeah. But SOS 2.0, most comprehensive ocean cleanup legislation in the history of the country. We checked with the Congressional Research Service, see if we could say that, and we could. So we say it a lot.
I also pointed out that we do our ocean cleanups with trash bags, and you do yours with front-end loaders, dumpsters, and barges.
It's really a big
it's a big
deal.
deal.
A huge deal in Alaska. We have more coastline than the rest of the country combined in Alaska, if you can envision that. It's a lot of coastline. It's a big state. But you already heard Senator Whitehouse talk about the size of states. I'm not sure you heard him say Alaska is 491 times bigger than Rhode Island.
No, but you've heard it now.
This comes out in every one of our bipartisan discussions.
Well, since we got to hear Senator Whitehouse's version of working on the bill,
Yeah.
I would love to hear yours and what
Well,
that
look,
experience
I
might
want to
be.
give Senator Whitehouse a ton of the credit. We were on the EPW committee together early, right when I got in 2015, and just started talking about it. And then I was on the Commerce Committee and chaired the subcommittee in charge of oceans and Coast Guard, and we just started collaborating on this idea and what it would mean in terms of a good bipartisan example of a project legislation that unites people. So the first bill, SOS, the first Save Our Seas Act, was pretty modest. It was mostly about cleanup. We had some ideas for states that got hit with kind of extraordinary disasters and things like that, but it was all about cleanup. Got that passed, and had a White House signing ceremony with President Trump, which was very memorable. I made sure he got invited. Truly. All
I
right.
just about went nuts when they found out that Dan was actually going to insist that I be there.
Yeah, no, I did. But it was really good because we got the Trump administration really interested. So we had the executive branch really interested. We got President Trump really interested, which he was. And then we got industry, environmental groups. So this was like a really good example of all stakeholders being aligned. Democrats, Republicans, the legislative branch, executive branch, environmental groups, private industry, and they were all aligned. So then we're like, oh, let's do 2.0. And then that was the big
Can
one.
I interrupt on 1.0?
Sure.
Just to point out that, what you're seeing here is Senator Dan Sullivan. But if you want things to happen in the executive branch of government, there's another creature that emerges, and that is United States Marine Colonel Dan Sullivan, who goes into people's offices and tells them to get their act together, but now. And
in the Marine Corps, we learn how to kick indoors early, right? And so we did a little.
So Dan had a
door kicking.
big impact in the executive branch.
So then on SOS 2.0, that was like much more comprehensive, upstream, international. In the Senate, it was 3 committees. In the House, it was 8 committees. That's a lot. That's a complicated piece of legislation to get done through that many committees. And we just kept working it, and explaining to people. It was very bipartisan. Everybody, all the different stakeholder groups came together. I will tell you one, though, and since we have a journalist here, sometimes when you have issues that unite people, this is just my own assessment, they don't always get the attention that you might think of an issue that makes people fight. So we did this big press conference, and we had this group called the Alliance to End Plastic Waste. This is a Fortune 50 group of the top companies in the world that have dedicated over $1 billion for ocean cleanup. That's serious money. We had all the top environmental groups. We had the Trump administration people, and he and I were doing a press conference. And so we did this big press conference on Save Our Seas 2.0, and with all these groups with us. And I don't think we got one story, like not a story, just yawn. It's boring. No one fighting. So we kind of committed. All right, next time you and I do a press conference, let's start and I'll bring a lemon meringue pie, and you bring a lemon meringue pie, and we start it, and I'll smash you in the face, and then you smash me in the face, and you call me a knuckle-dragging conservative, and I'll call you a woolly-headed liberal, and then everybody will write about it, right? And so we haven't done that yet.
We haven't done that yet, but we still
that
have
is a
3.0.
lesson. It is a lesson.
Still 3.0 to hope for.
Yeah, so. And the final thing I'll say on the since we're here in the beautiful Bloomberg facility, and I was honored to have a tour of this several months ago with the leadership of Bloomberg, and including Mr. Michael Bloomberg. But one really exciting thing about Save Our Seas 2.0, which we're implementing, is the Marine Debris Foundation. This is a public-private partnership. It's headquartered in Alaska, which we're excited about.
Where is it headquartered?
Headquartered in Alaska.
Just checking.
Which we're excited about. And that was tough. I felt very good about that because Secretary Raimondo's from Rhode Island, Senator Whitehouse from Rhode Island. So, but we got in Alaska. And this has a great capacity for public money. It's got seeded with public money. But for private donations to really help a foundation set up, grow, to focus on innovative solutions for ocean cleanup. We think that's a really neat part of this legislation, and there's so much interest in it that we're looking to grow that foundation. It's got like a Genius Prize for the private sector to come in and say, for example, one example, if you had a plastic bottle, right? If you could make that with water, if you could make that fully biodegradable, because they're not, right? I mean, we think that would be great. The company that comes up with that idea would probably make a lot of money and do good for the environment and the ocean. So that's all happening now. It's really exciting. So, we might come by Bloomberg Foundation to see if they're interested in helping grow the foundation. But it just started. It's really exciting.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And aside from the lemon meringue pie lesson coming out of this experience, what other lessons have you learned from working on Save Our Seas and that you think can be applied to other
One
forms
was that Alaska's 491 times the size of Rhode Island.
I don't think anyone
Hadn't been aware of
would
that
forget
particular
that
fact,
stat
but now
anymore.
it's drilled into my mind. The other interesting thing that happened was when we had the first hearing in the EPW committee, Senator Inhofe from Oklahoma, which has no coast in millions of years, came, and he has been my inveterate enemy on everything having to do with climate. So I just rolled my eyes back and said, God damn it, why did he have to show up? Couldn't he at least given me one hearings piece on an issue where he doesn't even care because he's from Oklahoma and doesn't have an ocean? That was my preconception. At the end of the hearing, he came up to Dan and me and he said, when you get done with your bill, would you let me have a look at it? I'd like to be an original co-sponsor.
Yeah.
And when he asked his questions of the witnesses, he went back to his childhood, going to the Texas coast and sitting up late at night in the lawn chair with the flashlight to make sure that folks driving up and down the beach didn't run over the little sea turtles coming out of their shells and heading back to the ocean. So who knew?
Yeah.
So my lesson was, with your colleagues, look for their inner sea turtle, and you can who knows what might happen.
Yeah, no, it's a
He had
great
a soft spot
example.
for sea turtles.
Unfortunately, Senator Inhofe, you may have heard, just
He
passed away
yeah.
recently. Great guy, but he was a real big champion of this. We had a lot of kind of Senate members who were not from states with any ocean or any coastline at all. So I think one of the things that was a lesson from my perspective, when you can lay out a vision for a really important environmental issue, as we said in the signing when President Trump signed the first legislation, like who doesn't want to clean up our oceans, right? That's a really important issue that people care about. But that you can also kind of say, but this is solvable. This is solvable. So what do I mean by that? The estimates vary, but it's like one of the reports that Senator Whitehouse and I saw is 10 rivers in Asia and Africa account for well over 60% of the ocean debris in the oceans, right? Now, if you can target those places, which you can really make a big impact. And, a lot of that actually ends up on the shores of Alaska. So that's, again, a topic that matters for our sustainable oceans, but sustainable fisheries and a whole host of other things that connect. And so that's one of the lessons we're learning on this Fish Act that we're working on right now, which has a whole host of common interests from all kinds of different senators who care about sustainable oceans, sustainable fisheries, national security, going after China, who's a real big abuser of kind of high seas fishing and abusive slave labor, because a lot of these fishing fleets use, almost indentured servant. So we're kind of raising all those issues, and certain senators are like, oh, I really care about like labor issues, so I want to be part of your Fish Act. Oh, I'm a real hawk against China. I want to be part of your Fish Act. Oh, I really care about fisheries and sustainable fishing. I want to be part of your Fish Act. So you kind of, to Sheldon's point, you can target different folks. Who knew that Jim Inhofe really cared about sea turtles in the Gulf of Mexico? But he did, and he became original co-sponsor of our bill.
That opened a lot of space for
Opened a lot of
senators
space
to join.
And Senator Sullivan, you just mentioned there are a myriad of threats facing our oceans, and you're now looking at fisheries. What are some of the threats facing oceans that are most concerning to both of you right now, and how do you see sort of U.S. leadership and policy being part of both domestic and global solutions in those areas?
So look, I think that this issue is still a really important issue globally, kind of that we can lead on. We've been trying to convince our government to do more internationally in terms of ocean debris, plastics in particular, and make sure we're keeping the stakeholder groups aligned. And that's not always easy. There's a negotiation going on right now that, if there's a treaty, it would have to go through the Senate. You need a, 2/3 for treaties. So you have to keep that alignment. So that's one. I have a little bit more of a local one. Senator Whitehouse helped me on, but it's also big. In Alaska, so over 60% of all seafood harvested in America comes from Alaska. So that's sport, commercial, subsistence. And the subsistence fisheries are really, really important to our state, our native communities, and we've kind of had best of times, worst of times for some of our salmon runs. We're a really big state, but depending on the river, depending on the kind of salmon it is, some of these salmon runs, Bristol Bay, sockeye salmon runs have been doing incredible. Some of the biggest runs in the world. My wife's Alaska native. Her family's had what they call a traditional, she's Athabascan fish camp on the Yukon River. The iconic fish probably of all Alaska is the Yukon River king salmon. That fishery has crashed, completely crashed. And so I had legislation, Senator Whitehouse helped me on it, passed a year and a half ago called the Alaska Salmon Research Task Force Act. And it passed. We kind of use the same, coalition, right? Help us, right? This is a big issue. It's nonpartisan, it's bipartisan. And the whole issue is that we're looking at these different salmon runs with the best minds in the world, state, federal, university, indigenous, native, like what's happening to these runs? Why are some of these runs doing so great? Why are some of these runs doing so poorly? And what research are we missing on being able to figure out the problem? And it's very complicated. This task force came together and within less than a year put together a really, really good report. It's out. It came out like 2 months ago. So we're going to build on that to help us try to figure this out. So that was just another good example. It's a little more localized, but given that our fisheries, our salmon fisheries are some of the biggest in the world, it is a global issue too.
Absolutely.
For me, it's obviously climate change. The metric I use is the zettajoule, the joule being the unit of heat energy. Zetta means it has 21 zeros. So even by congressional standards, it is a massive number. The entire world production of energy is half of a zettajoule. That's how big the number is. And for the price of the fossil fuel component of that half zettajoule, we put 14 zettajoules worth of excess heat into the oceans. That's why we're losing coral reefs. That may have something to do with what's going on with salmon. It's certainly why fisheries like winter flounder and lobster have crashed in Rhode Island. It's probably affecting the Atlantic current. So a lot is going on when you're adding that much excess waste heat to the oceans, and we don't solve that until we solve the climate problem.
Absolutely. And, Senators, I know you both run to a vote, but to wrap things up, since we're talking about solutions here, now we have the UN General Assembly in New York. It's Climate Week. A lot of excitement and chatter around what is coming. What do you hope to see from the General Assembly this year and around climate issues and also from Climate Week in terms of innovation or potential solutions that could be coming down the pipeline?
Well, I was actually just at the UN General Assembly the last 2 days. I don't think many senators know this. I didn't know this, but we have an official Senate delegation that goes up that's part of the broader delegation. It's bipartisan, so I went up with Senator Ben Cardin. Some of you know Senator Cardin, Democrat from Maryland, chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee. So he and I just spent the last 2 days meeting with world leaders as kind of the two members representing the United States Senate. To be perfectly honest, I focus more on the national security issues that were happening in the Middle East and around the world, in Ukraine. But I think, to me, what I always look for on these issues is, and that maybe we just go back to SOS 1.0 and 2.0 and 3.0 and the Fish Act, are the issues that can unite us and where we can try to find common ground on the environment. I think there's a whole host of environmental issues that people care about, certainly in my state, that they care about. It's no mystery. Senator Whitehouse and I don't always agree on kind of energy policy issues. Alaska's a really important energy state for our country. One area where I think there's increasing agreement among members of Congress, senators, is the need for critical minerals, right? If you're going to have renewable technologies, if you're going to have EVs, you need critical minerals. We have a lot of critical minerals in our state. We have a lot of critical minerals in America. Right now, the country that dominates critical mineral trade and production is China. Well, I'll tell you this, if you did mining and processing in Alaska, your environmental standards would be 1,000 times higher than they are in China right now. But somehow, some way, we outsource everything to China on issues of critical minerals, which is bad for the environment, bad for our national security, bad for our workers. And so one of the things that I've been trying to do is do what Senator Whitehouse and I have done together on oceans, is bring bipartisan consensus on, hey, we have critical minerals in America. We have the highest standards in the world on mining and processing. Right now, the Chinese dominate that trade. They use it aggressively. If they're mad at your country, they'll cut off your critical mineral supply, your rare earth supply. Why are we reliant on this place that abuses their labor and abuses their environment to produce minerals that are so important to the world economy, including renewable energy issues and EV issues? So we're trying to move on that, and believe it or not, we're actually making a lot of progress on making critical mineral issues for America bipartisan. So that's one that I think is important. Doesn't get a lot of play, but does what we've done on other legislation, which is brings national security, interested senators, brings kind of anti-China hawk senators, brings environmental, people care about the environment, people care about renewables, people care about electric vehicles, and you're starting to see that stakeholder alignment. I think that's positive.
And of course, my priority is a little bit different. It's getting a price on carbon emissions of 1,200 different climate scenarios the IPC has reviewed. There are like 12 left that still get us a pathway to climate safety because we've squandered so much time. Every single one of them requires a price on carbon. And the good news is that the EU, through the so-called CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, is about to start doing that. The UK is joining them. That creates a new political environment to get a domestic price on carbon. That is, there is a very active bipartisan conversation going on that, but not a bipartisan agreed bill. There are bills in that space from each side. So that's a very interesting place to be working in. But to me, the motto is no carbon price, no climate safety. Simple as that.
Well, senators, we want to make sure you have time to get back
Thank you.
to do your actual
Thank
jobs. But thank you both so much for joining us today.
Yeah.
And we all really appreciate your time here. And next up, we are going to be bringing Professor David Love and Professor Vicki Nguyen up to talk a little bit more about plastics and what we're seeing in the world right now and what the current issues are.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you all so much for sticking with us for this portion of today's event. We heard a lot about policy for the past half hour or so, but it's really interesting to see what the impacts of policy are like in sort of real life, and that's what I'm hoping to chat with the two of you about. To get us going, I would love to just start with what concerns you both about plastics and sort of the current landscape of where we are, and why has it been so challenging to tackle plastic pollution?
Thank you. So I guess I can start. I'm Vicki Nguyen, and I'm in mechanical engineering, and we have a project funded by the National Science Foundation on recycled plastics, how to process them, how to make them just as good as virgin plastics. And so I was excited to be able to get this project because recycling is something that concerns me. I'm sure all of you have put recycled bottles, your milk bottles and your 2-liter water bottles and Coke bottles, and every time you go to the airport, you're grabbing a bottle of water, right? Order Chinese takeout containers, and it comes in these plastic containers, and we always kind of chuck them in the plastic bin. And then I think 3 years ago or 2 years ago, our university put out a message that you have to be really, really careful about what you put into these bins. Only number one, which is your PTE, your soda bottles, are really getting recycled because we've lost the ability to offshore these things. And if you put something else in there, we'll just have to chuck the entire bin. It goes to be incinerated into landfills. And so that kind of started me thinking about what's going on here with recycling. So I started reading about how ineffective our recycling process is, and I was just kind of shocked at the numbers. And I had been working with a couple of people at NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, on a different project on 3D printing. And they were also developing programs on the circular economy. And so it got us thinking about what can we do, what grant agency we can go to propose an idea of how to make recycling more possible. And so we chosen, because of our specialty, to tackle the mechanical part of recycling, not the chemistry, because that's also really important. There's funds attached to that. But how do we, as consumers, when we put plastics in for recycle, how do we understand that process? How to make that process more effective? And then how do we make products out of the recycled plastics so that they're more usable, that there's just as strong as using virgin plastics?
And David, since you focus on aquaculture and fisheries, we heard a lot of, obviously with the Marine Debris Act, a lot of plastic ends up in the oceans, ends up in our seafood. Again, like what is concerning to you, and where do you sort of see the impacts of our issues with recycling, our issues with our ability to handle the plastic waste that we produce, filtering into our food systems?
Yeah. So what we're seeing, from a food system perspective, is all these plastics out there in the environment. They're breaking down, whether it's weathering or UV or just tumbling, as they move through rivers, streams, out to the Chesapeake, out to the ocean. And we see a lot of microplastics, very, very small plastic pieces, lots of different shapes. They can be particles, they can be fibers, and they're getting into our food, working their way up through the food chain. And a lot of the food that we eat has plastic particles in it. They found it in salt, honey, bottled water. If you go to the grocery store, a lot of foods, seafood has it in it. Luckily for seafood, if it's in a fish, mostly it's in the stomach. So, we don't eat the stomach of fish. It gets gutted and headed. But for shrimp and oysters and mussels and clams, we eat those whole. And when you eat those organisms whole, you also eat their stomach, which that's where the plastic particles are residing. So that's a big concern. Where do we put that risk relative to other food safety risks is something that's still kind of under debate in the scientific community.
Yeah, and when we're thinking about sort of both the recycling issue, the manufacturing issue, then these downstream issues of all these little plastic particles ending up in our environment, sometimes I think it can be hard for an average person to sort of see that big picture from the life cycle, right, of a plastic thing, a single-use plastic item. Where do you two sort of see the biggest opportunities to find solutions within the life cycle of a plastic product?
Okay, so we're in the United States, we recycle about 8 or 9% of our plastics waste, total plastic waste. If you go to Europe, that number is between 30, it's about on average 30-something%. In some countries, like the Netherlands, it's approaching 50%. Lithuania is above 50%. And the EU in total has a goal of reaching 50% on average, I believe in 2030. I can't remember the year exactly. So there's a couple of ways that I think we can do to help with that. Not just us as consumers, but as a consumers, we can definitely be more conscious of what plastics we're using, reduce what we use, and what can be recycled, right? So educate ourselves on what can be recycled, and then perhaps put pressure on companies or legislation companies to design plastic products that can be recycled. And what can be recycled is single component plastics. If you have a laminated plastic, if you have plastics that have colorants, that have additives, that makes it really difficult to separate those components of plastics. They don't like to mix together, and that makes it difficult to process these plastics, and the plastics have worse properties. And a lot of times, companies see that there's a resistance towards consumers having products that are clear, not as colorful, perhaps not as strong or tough. There's some really nice properties of plastics. That's why they're so popular. So we start to design plastic products with recyclability in mind. We're going to have to let go of some of these great properties, and we have to tolerate some of that. The analogy being the paper straw, right? Paper straws are super annoying, but it does take away all of these single-use plastic straws that clog up that gets basically in the streams and the storm drains and out to the bay. So I think as consumers, that's where we can participate in this process is to know what is a recyclable plastic and to understand what it means to have products designed with recyclability in mind.
Yeah, I like that angle you're taking on the consumer, and I want to kind of pivot and say, consumers also need to know what's in the food they eat, what's in the water they drink, and when they can make these big picture connections between, their food has plastics in it, and they can walk that back and say, well, how did that get there? And then they start asking questions. Well, is that related to the trash I see on the street? Or is that related to, how many millions of tons of virgin plastic, or more than millions?
For total plastic production in the world is 400 million tons. And there's a great analogy to this I found in an article written by the MIT Tech Review. The total of human mass, like every human in the world, you take them and you weigh them, the estimate is 390 million tons. So the total plastic production is now exceeding the total human mass.
Yeah. And the more awareness we can have of sort of our place within the world, and plastics is just one kind of part of that story. We heard about the climate story, and I think just the connection between, where do we fit in all this? I think that's a really valuable connection to build. Again, these microplastics, you can't necessarily see them. So, that's why it takes being in a lab, counting them, that kind of thing.
Right.
Yeah.
And you sort of just can take a step back and see the bigger picture and how we're all sort of in that system, essentially. And I want to give our lovely audience here an opportunity to ask you both some questions as well. And so if anybody does have a question they would like to ask, there's a microphone in the back corner there, and would love to hear your thoughts on today's events. And if you have any questions for David or Vicky. Oh, certainly. Oh.
Thank you very much.
Oh, I don't think it's on.
Maybe now.
Yeah, let's try one more time.
Hello?
There you go, we've got you.
Hi. Great. Well, thank you very much for your words, for your interventions. I'm Manuel Carmona. I work here in DC at the European Union delegation to the US, a deputy head for global issues and innovation, including plastics. Plastics treaty is a big thing. We had it earlier. And I wanted to ask you both about this plastics treaty in particular, and how the US position might or might not be shifting regarding the production of plastics. So looking at the entire life cycle, entire value chain, and closing the tap, as well as recycling more, and cleaning up more. We certainly need to look also at the very start of the process. And I understand that the U.S. position is kind of more open now on that. How do you see the plastics treaty dealing with this, with the production part? Thanks.
Do you want to take that? I think neither of us really know about can directly answer your question there, but I would say that it is really important to work, in my opinion, it's really important to work with companies to design plastics with recycling in mind. And part of the hope for our project, I'll bring it back to my project, the NSF funded project, is to understand how to process recycled plastics, take them as they are, deal with the variability from batch to batch, how to process them better, how to understand, how to identify the different components, and what the end product is going to be, and how to modulate their properties. That way, if we can just replace part of the virgin plastics used in bottles, for example, with recycled plastic, it doesn't even need to be a total replacement, right? If we can just replace 37% of all plastic produced is packaged materials, right? It's for packaging. So we can that's a lot, millions of tons. So you can just replace part of that with recycled plastics and mix that with the virgin plastic. That would take out a lot of plastics, virgin plastic that is being produced, right? So those kind of research, I think, is really important, and those ideas of how to incorporate what we can do with recycled plastics. I think we can get better, more modern plastic recycling facilities that can sort better, then we can get better recyclates that have fewer impurities, and we can put them back into products. So that's my hope.
Anybody else have a question for our experts? Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time today. I did my master's thesis on sustainable aviation fuels, and what came up during the conversation looking at policy were the different production methods for SAF. So I won't give you the whole spiel, but one of those production pathways, power to liquid, also as a part of the process produces naphtha, which is my understanding is a precursor to plastic. So I was wondering, it might be a bit of a tangential question, but is there space in the conversation to reduce emissions for plastic production by using co-processing facilities that might have another output that is beneficial to the climate conversation as well, such as SAF?
I don't know.
A little too tangential?
Yeah,
Yeah.
maybe.
Maybe a little bit outside of their area of expertise, but a really fascinating question. I think when we sort of think about the trade-offs in a way of the things that we're doing, which tends to be a common refrain, I think, in most conversations when we talk about climate solutions. But I think, to your first question, is there anybody else sorry, before I go on, anybody else have a question for our panelists? Oh, there's one in the front.
Hi, I just was wondering around the Save Our Seas 3.0 that the senators mentioned, if there's anything that you both if you know much about that or anything that you're hoping to see in that version of the bill. They mentioned that the first two were kind of smaller start, and they were hoping to have a bit more expansiveness in the third one. So anything you could say on those?
Yeah. So, I mean, as far as I understand, these Save Our Seas 2.0 is ocean plastics, but there's more, out there for aquatic systems than ocean plastics. I had a really wonderful graduate student who finished up last term. Her name is Maya Disak. She kayaked the length of the Mississippi River. And as she went, she scooped water samples. Every single one of those water samples for the entire length of the Mississippi, from the headwaters in Minnesota all the way to New Orleans, had microplastics in it. So this is we've got ocean systems, we've got freshwater systems. So if they could add fresh water to the mix, I think that would be valuable. I know we talked to Marine Debris Pollution Program, and they're interested in all kinds of plastics. So I think just sort of an awareness that's more than just oceans would be one place I think you could expand and still get that sort of bipartisan support.
I was excited to hear that it includes recycling. So I'll definitely look it up and see what is being included. There's definitely a lot of federal interest in recycling. The Department of Energy has been funding research centers on upcycling, chemical upcycling of polymers. I know the National Science Foundation has been funding projects on sustainability, which includes recycling. That's what's funding our program. So it's always great to hear more government support for recycling.
Great. I think we have time for one last question, so let's go ahead.
Yes, hi. I wanted to ask you about how research plays into this. So we've been listening to a conversation about policy, and public opinion drives policy, but really good policy is informed by research. And clearly, you're both engaged in very specific, potentially one might say narrow areas of research, but they build up into what's really critical in terms of policy making. So, I mean, if you had a crystal ball and you could look ahead, do you have a vision for how your research can have a really systemic influence on the way we address this issue?
You go first.
Sure. Okay, so 10 years from now, we're going to have a really good understanding of how many microplastics are in food and which kinds of food. We're going to have research that connects it to what is the risk of doing it. And then hopefully a government agency is going to be in the mix, making sure that foods that are risky aren't being eaten. That would be one, a series of steps I could think we could really work towards. And the trajectory of the research is moving in that direction, but we're just not there yet.
Yeah. So we made some conscious choices for our team. And I mean to say that this is a bigger project, and I'm one PI of 4 on this team. And we made a decision to actually work with recyclates that we get from companies, not just pure plastics that we're mixing, because we wanted to have, we want to understand the actual applied problem, right? And one thing that I'm kind of proud of is the recent developments is that we're thinking about how to develop methods to identify what is in this mix of plastics that we get, because that's one of the big challenges. You get this, pellets from a company that provides recyclates. You don't really know what's in there, right? They say it's a certain polymer, but because of the difficulty in separating everything, it's all in there. So what I'm trying to say is that I hope through our research that we can develop technological solutions that are practical, may not be adopted right away. It'll get published in papers, and people will read about it and think about it, and hopefully down in, as you say, 10 years, that's kind of like our engineering thinking scheme is in 10 years, that these practical solutions, our research is going to turn into practical solutions that will get more recycled plastics in production of common parts that you use. That's my vision in the future. And as for the conversation, that's why I'm here with you and with you doing this, is to talk about these bigger issues and how we fit into it.
And given the scale and complexity of the plastic issue, we could be here for days talking if we wanted to, but unfortunately we are running up on time, and so we just wanted to thank our experts again for joining us, and you all for spending a little bit of your afternoon with us as well. Thank you.